Some men in the Old West relied on speed. Others relied on strength. But Doc Holliday played a different game. He turned weakness into a mask, words into weapons, and friends into shields. Every move he made was calculated, every risk taken with a gambler's calm. What set him apart was not just the gun at his side, but the way he outsmarted anyone who tried to bring him down. Number 1. Playing the sick man's advantage. Doc Holliday lived with tuberculosis, and most people saw that as a weakness. He understood something different. His illness made men think he was fragile, distracted, or too weak to be dangerous. That false picture was the first mistake his enemies made. When a rival looked at him and saw a man who could barely stand, Doc already had the upper hand. He let them believe he was vulnerable, so they would loosen their guard. This tactic worked in saloons, on the street, and at the card table. He often coughed hard enough to draw attention, then used the pause to hide a movement of his hand or shift his coat to reach for a weapon. Enemies thought he was struggling for air, but he was lining up his next step. His frailty was like a mask that bought him time and space. While others wasted energy trying to look strong, Doc leaned into looking weak because that weakness created openings he could exploit. At the poker table, he used the same advantage. Rivals assumed the sick man would be desperate for easy winnings. They believed he was too tired to calculate the game. Doc flipped that expectation. He sat calm, spoke little, and let the silence push opponents to reveal themselves. When they mistook his quiet coughs for distraction, he was reading their hands and spotting their nervous tics. They bet too high or too low, and he trapped them by turning their own confidence against them. The same psychology carried into confrontations. An angry cowboy or outlaw wanted to prove himself against the frail gambler. Doc knew pride would push them to act before thinking. Rage meant wide gestures, loud words, and sloppy footing. That is when he struck. His moves were short and efficient because he could not afford wasted breath. He chose corners and narrow spaces that forced his enemies to come at him one by one. Even his posture mattered. Leaning like a man barely able to stand made his sudden quickness all the more shocking. His sickness never left him, but he refused to let it cage him. Instead, he twisted it into a weapon sharper than most men's guns. By turning weakness into a disguise, he shaped every fight before it began. Enemies thought they were facing a man already halfway in the grave. What they were really facing was a gambler who knew exactly how to use death sitting on his shoulder as part of the game. Number 2. Turning words into weapons. Doc Holliday understood something that many of his enemies never realized until it was too late. A gunfight often started long before the pistols came out. In the Old West, reputation was currency, and pride was everything. A man could not allow himself to be insulted or mocked in front of others without responding, because that single moment of humiliation could destroy the respect he needed to survive. Doc knew this, and he played with it like a professional gambler shuffling cards. He didn't need to shout or threaten, and in fact, he rarely raised his voice. Instead, he had a way of speaking that slipped under a man's skin and made him feel exposed. It might be a remark about someone's honesty at the card table, a quiet suggestion that another man was bluffing, or even a dry laugh at just the wrong moment. Whatever the form, it hit where it hurt. The insult forced his rival into a corner, because once the crowd heard it, there was no way to back down without losing face. That was exactly the trap Doc wanted. At the poker table, this strategy became even more dangerous. Cards were not just about numbers, they were about nerves. A player who felt calm could hold steady, but a player who felt mocked and watched by the entire saloon would start to unravel. Doc made use of his sharp tongue in subtle ways, sometimes with a comment so small that it almost felt casual, but it always carried weight. He might cough into his handkerchief and then remark on how nervous another player seemed. He might stare too long at someone's hands, letting silence do the rest. His words worked together with his body language to push men off balance, and once they tilted, the game was his. The same tactic worked outside the card room. In saloons and on the streets, Holliday's words became bait, and the bait almost always worked. Angry men act too quickly. They lunge when they should wait, they draw before their aim is set, and they speak louder than they should. Doc remained calm, his voice steady, while his opponent burned with pride and fury. By the time the enemy stood up to fight, the outcome was already decided. The gun might have been the final tool, but it was the words that made sure the fight started on Doc's terms. Over time, stories about his tongue spread just as widely as stories about his pistol. Some people called him arrogant, others thought he was simply mean, but most agreed that he was dangerous because he could make a man destroy himself with anger. That reputation itself became a shield, because nobody wanted to be the next person publicly humiliated by the sickly gambler with the cutting wit. In towns across the frontier, men gave him space not only because of his gun, but because they feared being trapped in one of his verbal games. Even in legendary confrontations like the one at the OK Corral, witnesses remembered how Doc taunted the cowboys before a shot was fired. He used words to lock them into a fight they couldn't walk away from, because walking away would have meant shame. By the time the first bullet left its chamber, his enemies were already off balance. Holliday showed time and again that words, when used with precision, could be sharper than steel. Number 3. Owning the power of reputation. Doc Holliday understood that in the Old West, your name rode into a town before you did, and he worked that reality like a craftsman. Saloons, card rooms, newspapers, and the telegraph stitched together a fast rumor network, and Doc fed it with moments that people could not stop retelling. He did not brag, which would have sounded cheap. He let other men do the talking, while he made sure the scene they witnessed was unforgettable. A sharp line at the right time. A quiet smile after a clean win. A visible calm when everyone else was yelling. Those details stuck, and by the next evening, the story was already bigger than life. He never rushed to correct any part that came out larger than the truth, because the uncertainty helped him more than accuracy ever could. If men argued about how many he had killed, that argument kept his name hot, and kept hands cautious. When someone is not sure what you can do, they plan for the worst, and that planning slows them down. Doc also practiced selective visibility. He did not pick every fight, and he did not vanish when a public win could reset the balance of fear in his favor. If an enemy pushed him in a crowded room, he answered on a stage where the witnesses were plentiful and the angle favored him. That way, the story traveled with a built-in chorus. He dressed better than most cowboys, which made him stand out in a doorway, and he kept his posture loose, which made the sudden snap of movement look even sharper. That contrast was theater, and theater builds legends. He used location to guide the script. A narrow passage made a duel look like skill rather than luck. A table against a wall told the crowd he was impossible to flank. Even the handkerchief at his lips was part signal and part symbol. The cough said he was weak, and the outcome said he was not. People remember that kind of whiplash because it feels like a twist in a story, and they retell it with extra heat. He also borrowed the weight of other names. Standing next to Wyatt Earp gave him a frame that the public could read at a glance. If a respected lawman trusted this sickly gambler in a gunfight, then the gambler must be worse than the rumors. That logic did not need proof. It just needed repetition, and Tombstone supplied that on a nightly schedule. Doc leaned on law when it helped, and leaned away from it when distance kept his options open. That flexible identity made his enemies nervous because they could not pin him to a single box. Nervous men overreact, and overreaction feeds the legend again. He managed Fallout the same way. If a killing drew charges, he showed up with a lawyer, kept his mouth short, and let the local arguments grind down. A courtroom implied process, and process calmed some tempers, which bought him time to move on, while the town kept arguing about the story they now felt part of. Dime papers loved men who looked like trouble and talked like gentlemen, so they carried his name across rail stops and stage routes. By the time a fresh group of cowboys met him, they had already decided he was dangerous. That decision shaped every later choice. They watched his hands. They measured their words. They hesitated a breath at the wrong moment. Doc built that hesitation on purpose. He turned reputation into a constant head start, so every new fight began with his enemy already a step behind. Number 4. Choosing friends like weapons. Doc Holliday was clever enough to know that surviving in the Old West was not just about your own skills. It was also about who you stood beside. He was never truly a lone figure wandering from town to town. He attached himself to powerful allies, and the most important of these was Wyatt Earp. Their friendship was not only about loyalty, though it ran deep. It was also a tactical choice. By staying close to the Earps, Doc wrapped himself in their authority and their reputation. Enemies who wanted to challenge him now had to think about what came after. Starting trouble with Holliday could mean bringing down the wrath of an entire family of lawmen. That risk alone kept many would-be challengers quiet. The bond with Wyatt Earp also gave Holliday room to blur his own image. Some days he looked like an outlaw gambler who lived off cards and whiskey. Other days, he acted as the deputy's shadow, helping enforce order with deadly precision. This shifting identity made it almost impossible for enemies to place him neatly on one side of the line. If they treated him like an outlaw, they might suddenly find him standing in court as part of the law. If they thought he was simply a lawman, they could be shocked to find him back at the saloon tables with the roughest crowd in town. That unpredictability was powerful. Men like consistency, because consistency can be measured. Holliday gave them none. The alliance with the Earps also proved its value during moments of crisis. At the OK Corral, Doc's presence made a real difference. Wyatt trusted him enough to know he would stand and fight. The cowboys facing them had to consider not only Wyatt's calm authority, but also the sickly gambler at his side who was rumored to be reckless and fearless. The combination created doubt, and doubt weakens resolve. By choosing allies carefully, Holliday multiplied his own influence far beyond what one man could achieve. Doc also understood that friends were not just protection. They were tools for shaping his reputation. When towns saw Wyatt Earp openly ride with him, it sent a signal that he was more than a drifting card player. It gave him legitimacy, even when whispers called him a killer. He leaned on that legitimacy whenever he needed to walk free from charges or cool down tensions after a shooting. Having lawmen as friends meant juries and judges thought twice before condemning him. The friendships worked like invisible armor in places where bullets could not reach. At the same time, Holliday was careful not to tie himself down completely. He kept ties with outlaws, gamblers, and drifters who carried news and provided shelter. He was part of both worlds, and he used each side when it suited his needs. This balancing act was dangerous, but it kept him ahead. If he had been only an outlaw, the law would have crushed him. If he had been only a lawman, every outlaw would have hunted him. By living in the gray zone, he forced his enemies to hesitate. Doc Holliday knew that friends could be as sharp as weapons. He did not just carry a revolver. He carried Wyatt Earp's loyalty, the Earp's authority, and the fear that came with both. In a world where alliances often decided who lived to see the next sunrise, Holliday built his friendships into shields and blades that kept him alive when many stronger men fell. Number 5. Betting with nothing to lose. Doc Holliday lived every day knowing he was dying, and that knowledge shaped the way he fought, spoke, and carried himself. Tuberculosis was slowly taking his strength, but instead of letting it weaken him, he turned it into his most dangerous weapon. Most men in the Old West tried to avoid risk because they wanted to stay alive. Holliday accepted that death was already chasing him, which meant he could gamble with a freedom that terrified others. When an outlaw or a cowboy squared off with him, they expected to see fear. They thought he would hesitate because of his sickness. What they found instead was a man who stood steady, almost careless, as if the outcome did not matter. That attitude created doubt. His enemies started to ask themselves why he was not afraid. Doubt is poison in a fight, because the moment you wonder about your opponent, you lose focus on your own move. Holliday thrived on that hesitation. He was not reckless in the sense of being foolish. His recklessness was calculated. He knew that a man who looks ready to die can take risks that no one else dares. He walked into dangerous towns with confidence. He stood by Wyatt Earp when others backed away from the fight. He played hands of poker that looked insane, not because he was desperate, but because he enjoyed pushing others to fold under pressure. That same spirit showed up in gunfights. Where another man might retreat, Doc stood his ground. He had already accepted the worst, and that gave him control. This mindset also explains why people described him as fearless. Fearless does not mean without nerves. It means acting in spite of them. Holliday acted like a man who had nothing left to lose, and in many ways, that was the truth. His cough reminded him every morning that time was running short. Instead of clinging to safety, he leaned into risk. He believed that a man who fears death cannot fight clean because his hands and his heart will always be a little too heavy. Holliday fought light because he was already living on borrowed time. This attitude unnerved everyone around him. Enemies did not know how to handle a man who seemed comfortable with dying. Friends admired him, but sometimes feared him too. In saloons, people whispered that he welcomed trouble. At the OK Corral, his courage to step forward with a shotgun when others hesitated came from that same core truth. He knew that even if the fight killed him, it would only shorten a life that was already fading. Doc Holliday outsmarted his enemies by carrying death like a card already laid on the table. He played every move with a kind of freedom that no healthy man could copy. Others fought to survive. He fought to win, even if winning meant falling in the process. And that is why, time after time, men stronger and healthier than him still walked away defeated, while he kept gambling with nothing to lose.